The speedometer hit 95 mph, but three trucks behind him matched the pace with mechanical precision. No engine sound, no radio chatter, just silent pursuit on a stretch of Nevada asphalt that should have been empty. What happened next challenges everything you think you know about America's trucking routes, because some interstates don't just connect cities, they collect drivers who never make it home. At exactly 11:47 p.m. on Route 34, physics stopped working the way it should. The GPS showed 66 mph, while the speedometer screamed past 90, a mathematical impossibility that any trucker will tell you defies reality. But this contradiction was just the beginning for a man who'd promised his wife he'd be home for their anniversary dinner. The same celebration where 15 years ago she had waited 3 hours when his rig broke down on their very first date. Jake Hendricks wasn't just any driver. He'd started trucking after losing his factory job in Ohio when his wife was pregnant with their first child. "This route will provide," he'd told her, kissing goodbye on a snowy morning in 2011. 13 years later, the interstate had delivered everything: steady income, a house with a white picket fence, college funds for kids who'd grown up while Daddy hauled freight across America. But tonight, Route 34 was about to demand payment for all those years of faithful service. Tonight, you're going to witness trucker ghost stories that aren't stories at all, but warnings disguised as entertainment. Jake was about to discover why some highway horror stories are filed as missing person reports instead of campfire tales. Because when you're driving alone through desert darkness and beams appear with license plates from 1952, you've just become part of real paranormal encounters that connect every haunted stretch of America's interstate system. The Phantom Convoy doesn't chase drivers. It recruits them for an asphalt web that exists in the spaces between our maps and our nightmares. What you're about to hear isn't fiction. It's pieced together from CB radio recordings, truck stop security footage, and evidence that law enforcement has kept classified for over 70 years. Because some truths are too dangerous for the general public, and some roads are too hungry to remain empty for long. Route 34 through Nevada had been Jake Hendricks' regular run for 12 years, and tonight it felt different, wrong in ways that made his wedding ring catch the dashboard glow as he gripped the wheel tighter. The asphalt stretched ahead, like his wife's dark hair across their pillow that morning, familiar but somehow changed in the desert that resembled God's own graveyard under moonlight. His CB radio sat dead silent when it should have been alive with trucker chatter, the usual voices that made lonely nights bearable completely absent. Everyone's experienced that moment when the interstate feels too quiet, too empty, like you're the last person alive on Earth. For Jake, that moment started at 11:47 p.m. and would end with him joining something that shouldn't exist. Memories struck without warning. His wife at 22, standing in their tiny apartment kitchen, flour dusting her dark hair as she attempted to bake their first anniversary cake. "Promise me something, Jake," she'd said, not looking up from the mixing bowl. "Promise me you'll always come home." He'd laughed then, young and invincible, pulling her close despite the flour on her apron. "Always, baby. The interstate's just a job. You're my destination." Now, 12 years later, that vow felt like a weight around his neck, dragging him down into something darker than the Nevada desert could ever imagine. Twin beams appeared in his rearview mirror, cutting through darkness with surgical precision, their chrome bumpers reflecting starlight like liquid mercury. What struck him first wasn't their presence. Other rigs used this route constantly, but their complete, unnatural silence that violated every law of diesel physics. Jake rolled down his window, expecting the familiar rumble of another big rig, but desert air carried nothing except empty breath and the scent of sage that reminded him of Linda's shampoo. The illumination maintained perfect distance behind him, neither gaining nor falling back, moving with shadows that had learned to drive themselves. Any driver who's hauled I-80 through Nevada knows that feeling when beams follow too perfectly, but this transcended normal highway experience. Jake had always been gifted at reading the interstate, understanding the unspoken language that connected drivers across America's asphalt arteries. His father had taught him that skill before cancer took him, back when Jake was 17 and thought trucking was just a summer job to pay for college. "The pavement talks to you, son," the old man had wheezed from his hospital bed, oxygen tubes snaking across weathered cheeks. "You just gotta know how to listen." But tonight, Route 34 was speaking in a dialect Jake had never learned, using words that belonged in nightmare dictionaries and conversations that violated the natural order of things. Shifting to the left lane, a routine maneuver he'd performed thousands of times without thinking, Jake watched something beyond explanation happen in his mirrors. The beams moved in perfect synchronization, as if connected by invisible strings to his steering wheel. But here's where reality fractures completely. His GPS showed the interstate completely empty behind him. No heat signatures, no vehicles detected, just his truck alone on asphalt, where 3 sets of illumination blazed like fallen stars. He shifted back right, and they followed with mechanical precision that defied human reaction time. The CB static reminded him of Linda's hairdryer that morning, a comforting domestic sound that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life, someone who still believed in anniversary dinners and vows that could be kept. He reached for his CB radio, that lifeline connecting every driver on America's interstate system to safety and brotherhood. Channel 19 should have been alive with road reports and friendly banter that made drivers feel less alone, but instead, static filled his cab like the sound of dead air punctuated by his own nervous breathing. Jake tried adjusting squelch, checking connections, when something cut through the white noise like a blade through silk. A voice, low and measured, unnaturally clear. "Don't slow down, Jake. But here's what should terrify you." The voice knew his name, a name he'd never given to anyone on this stretch of Nevada asphalt, a name that belonged to a man who had vows to keep and a wife waiting at home. Blood turned to ice water as his rearview mirror revealed the truth that would haunt highway horror stories for decades to come. 3 massive trucks now followed behind him, their beams forming a perfect triangle in darkness, and this is where reality breaks completely. Their license plates all read Nevada 1952. Jake was absolutely certain that seconds ago there had been only one set of lights, but there they were, 3 phantom rigs rolling through night like manifestations of every trucker ghost story ever whispered in all-night diners. His wedding ring caught the dashboard glow one more time, as he realized his anniversary celebration was about to become the least of his problems, and his long, lonely drive home had just become something that would challenge everything he thought he knew about the interstates that connected America. Pressing harder against the accelerator, Jake watched his speedometer climb past 70, then 80, then 95 miles per hour. And here's where physics stopped making sense in ways that would make scientists weep. The diesel engine roared in response like a caged animal, but behind him, those 3 trucks with their 1952 plates matched his speed with precision that belonged in nightmares, not on real Nevada asphalt. There was no sound of engines working harder, no change in distance between them, just perfect mechanical synchronization that brought to mind Linda's sewing machine when it locked into the same deadly stitch pattern, but infinitely more terrifying. The first time Jake had felt truly afraid on the interstate was in 2018, during an ice storm in Wyoming. His trailer had started jackknifing on I-80, and for 15 terrifying seconds, 60,000 pounds of steel had danced on black ice with the grace of a ballerina made of death. He'd managed to straighten out, pulling into a truck stop with tremors so violent he couldn't light his cigarette. That night he'd called his wife and told her everything. The fear, the certainty that he was about to die. the way time had stretched like taffy during those endless seconds. "Maybe it's time to find something closer to home," she'd whispered. But the interstate had called him back, as it always did, promising him that Wyoming ice storms were the worst he'd ever face. The pavement had lied. Mile marker 77 appeared in his beams like a green ghost against darkness, its reflective surface catching his illumination. But the trucking GPS showed no mile marker for another 3 miles of empty desert. As his truck passed the sign, something happened that would be filed under unexplained road phenomena, if anyone survived to report it. The asphalt beneath his tires began to ripple like water, disturbed by stones thrown from heaven itself. Jake felt his massive 18-wheeler sway as if 60,000 pounds of steel and cargo had suddenly become weightless, defying gravity and everything he'd learned about truck handling in 12 years of professional driving. The interstate seemed to breathe under his wheels, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his racing heartbeat and the memory of his wife's pulse against his palm that morning. Temperature readings on his dashboard told a story that violated thermodynamics. Outside temp showed 72 degrees, but frost was forming on his windshield. Engine temperature remained normal, but the air inside his cab had become so cold he could see his breath forming small clouds that reminded him of camping trips with Linda before the kids were born. They'd shared a sleeping bag under Colorado stars, her body warm against his as she traced patterns on his chest with her fingertip. "Promise me we'll always have adventures," she'd whispered. "Promise me we won't become one of those couples who just watch TV every night." He'd agreed, not knowing that his greatest adventure would be the one that took him away from her forever. Wait, what? The temperature inside his cab plummeted without warning, his breath suddenly visible in small puffs that brought back memories of their first winter together, when they'd been too poor to heat their apartment properly. The dashboard clock had begun spinning backward, its red numbers blurring as they cycled through time in reverse, like a slot machine paying out years instead of coins, counting down to something he didn't want to imagine. The heater ran full blast, but cold seeped through his truck's walls as if it was made of paper instead of steel, designed to protect drivers from exactly this kind of unnatural situation. Frost began forming on the inside of his windshield, creating crystalline patterns that resembled road maps to places that didn't exist on any earthly atlas. Through his mirrors, Jake watched the 3 sets of beams begin blinking in a pattern that made his skin crawl. Not random flashing of turn signals, but deliberate sequence that reminded him of the Morse code his grandfather had taught him during childhood summers before the old man had disappeared on a cross-country haul and never come home. Long flash, short flash, 3 long flashes, then darkness for several heartbeats before the pattern repeated. SOS, SOS, SOS. His CB radio remained dead silent, but somehow Jake felt certain the illumination was trying to communicate something urgent, almost desperate, like warnings being transmitted across the void between their trucks and his rapidly shrinking sanity. But that's not the strangest part. Jake accelerated again, pushing his truck beyond safe limits, desperate to outrun whatever nightmare had found him on Route 34 and somehow make it home to his wife's worried smile and their anniversary celebration. The speedometer hit 100, then climbed toward the red line, the engine screaming in protest as he demanded more power than the old Kenworth was designed to give. But as he crested a small hill, his pulse stopped cold and his GPS showed something that made reality crumble like old newspaper. He was driving in a perfect circle on a straight interstate. There, illuminated in his beams like a green beacon of impossibility, stood mile marker 77 again. Same sign, same weathered paint, same small dent in the lower right corner he'd memorized the first time. The convoy of real paranormal encounters was still following, their 1952 plates gleaming, their beams blinking that same desperate message, and Jake realized that time itself had become his enemy on pavement that refused to let him reach his destination. The CB radio crackled to life with static that made him jump like he'd been struck by lightning. And through the white noise came a woman's voice that would haunt his dreams if he lived long enough to have them. Clear and melodic, but carrying undertones that made his skin crawl like insects beneath his shirt, she spoke with supernatural certainty. In about 30 seconds, you're going to check your fuel gauge, then look in your left mirror, and you'll see the middle truck has moved closer. His eyes involuntarily shot to the fuel gauge, 3/4 full, exactly as it had been all night. Then to his left mirror, where the center truck with its mystifying 1952 plate had indeed crept forward, now riding dangerously close to his trailer. The woman's laugh drifted through the speaker like smoke from a fire he couldn't see, soft and knowing, as if she was watching his every move from somewhere between reality and nightmare. The voice reminded Jake of someone, but the memory felt slippery, like trying to hold water in his hands. Then it hit him. His grandmother, who'd claimed she could see things that hadn't happened yet. She'd warned his mother not to let his father take that construction job in Detroit, said she'd seen him falling from scaffolding in her dreams. 3 weeks later, the call came. "Some folks got the sight, Jakey," she'd told him at the funeral, her weathered hand gripping his 8-year-old fingers. "And some folks just see what they want to see. You be careful which one you turn out to be." Now, 30 years later, Jake understood that some people saw the future and some people were trapped in it, forced to watch their fate unfold like a movie they couldn't stop or change. Here's where it gets beyond comprehension. Jake grabbed his CB handset, his voice cracking as he keyed the microphone with shaking fingers. "Who is this? What do you want?" But before the words fully left his mouth, the woman's voice cut through again in perfect synchronization. "Who is this? What do you want?" She spoke his lines with surgical precision, down to the tremor of fear that made his voice sound like a frightened child's. The synchronization was so exact, it felt like she was reading his thoughts before his brain could form them, predicting his every reaction with the confidence of someone who'd played this game before. Jake tried again, changing his words desperately. "This isn't real." But again she spoke in perfect unison, her voice overlapping his like an echo that arrived before the original sound, proving that this wasn't another highway horror story. It was happening to him right now. The woman's voice softened, taking on the tone his wife used when she was trying to explain something difficult to their children. "Jake, honey, you need to understand something. That promise you made to Linda this morning, about being home for dinner, you've already broken it. You broke it the moment you saw our beams." The words hit him like physical blows because he remembered that morning perfectly. His wife standing at the kitchen counter in her blue robe, coffee mug in her hands, worry lines creasing her forehead. "You've been pushing too hard lately," she'd said. "Maybe take an extra day, see some sights." But Jake had kissed her cheek and promised he'd be home by 6, promised they'd celebrate 15 years of marriage with takeout from Antonio's and maybe a bottle of wine. Now that vow felt like a lie he'd told to a stranger. In his mirrors, Jake could finally see inside the pursuing trucks' cabs, and what he saw there belonged in the files of unexplained road phenomena that government agencies kept locked away from public view. Human shapes sat behind the wheels, perfectly still, their hands positioned at 10 and 2 o'clock like mannequins arranged by some cosmic puppeteer with a sick sense of humor and infinite patience. They didn't move, didn't shift, didn't even seem to breathe, just maintained rigid poses while their trucks followed his every maneuver with mechanical precision that shouldn't exist in a world governed by human reflexes. The figures wore old trucker gear from decades past, flannel shirts that looked like they'd been pressed in 1952, trucker caps that belonged in museums, and leather gloves that seemed permanently fused to their steering wheels as if they'd been driving for 70 years without a break. The radio on his dashboard flickered to life without warning, filling the cab with the tinny sound of a 1950s ballad he'd never heard but somehow recognized, as if it had been playing in his subconscious for years. The singer crooned about lonely highways and drivers who never made it home to their families, while steel guitar wailed in the background like a lost soul crying for redemption that would never come. His hand shot to the power knob. It was turned off, had been off all night, but music continued pouring from speakers like blood from an open wound. The volume seemed to rise and fall with his heartbeat, growing louder when his fear spiked and dropping to whispers when he tried to calm himself and think of his wife's face. Behind the melody, he could hear something else. The faint sound of diesel engines that belonged to an era when trucks were simpler and interstates were lonelier. But here's what should make you check your own mirrors tonight. As Jake rounded a sweeping curve, he watched the convoy disappear behind rocky outcropping, swallowed by desert landscape as if they'd never existed at all. For one blessed moment, silence returned to the interstate. No beams, no mysterious voices, no otherworldly music from his dead radio. His shoulders began to relax, his death grip on the steering wheel loosening slightly as he dared to hope that whatever nightmare had found him was finally over and he could still make it home to explain his lateness. But then, up ahead on the right shoulder, 3 massive trucks sat parked in perfect formation, their engines silent, their 1952 plates catching his beam glow, waiting like predators that had somehow circled around to get ahead of their prey. Jake realized with growing horror that he was living through real paranormal encounters that would join the whispered legends of every haunted stretch of America's interstate system, if anyone survived to tell the tale. The CB exploded with voices, not one, but dozens, all talking at once in a cacophony that made his ears ring. But these weren't normal trucker voices sharing road conditions or weather reports. These were desperate, broken men pleading for help that would never come. "Day 847 on the loop," rasped one voice. "GPS still shows the same mile marker." Another voice, younger, sobbing, "My wife thinks I'm dead. Maybe I am." A third, older and resigned, "Welcome to the club, new guy. Hope you said goodbye." The voices organized themselves, taking turns like they'd done this before, as if they had all the time in the world to explain the inexplicable. "Name's Bobby Hutchins," said the first voice, crackling through the static. "Been driving this loop since 1987. Saw the convoy outside of Bakersfield. Thought they needed help with a breakdown. That was 36 years ago." Tremors ran through Jake as he realized what he was hearing. Men who'd been trapped in this nightmare for decades, their families mourning them while they drove endless miles to nowhere. "Michael Chen here," came another voice, this one with a slight accent that spoke of second-generation immigrants chasing the American dream. "Picked up the trail in 1995, Christmas Eve. Was supposed to be home for my daughter's first Christmas. She'd be 28 now, got kids of her own probably. They stopped looking for me after the 5th year." The pain in his voice was raw, unhealed by decades of repetition. "My truck was found abandoned in Oregon, but I've never been to Oregon. The convoy took me straight here, to this place between places." Terror crept up Jake's spine as he keyed his CB, his voice barely a whisper. "How many of you are there?" The silence stretched for several heartbeats before another voice answered, this one so old and weathered it sounded like wind through canyon rocks. "Started counting in 1963, lost track somewhere around driver number 47. New guys show up every few months, sometimes every few years. This stretch of asphalt's got its own timeline, son. Depends on how hungry it gets." The oldest voice belonged to a man named Earl Jameson, who'd been driving the Phantom Interstate since 1952, the year on the license plates. "I was the first," he said, his voice carrying the weight of 70 years of mystifying miles. Saw something I shouldn't have seen out in the desert near Roswell. Men in black suits came to my house, talked to my wife. Official story was that I died in a truck accident, burned beyond recognition. But I was here, watching it all happen on pavement that doesn't exist on any map. Jake's blood ran cold as he realized he was talking to the original member of the Phantom Convoy, the man who'd started it all. The thing is, Bobby's voice cut through again, we're not dead. We're just elsewhere, displaced. Our families aged, moved on, died, but we're stuck in this moment, this eternal night drive. Sometimes we can see through the windows, catch glimpses of the real world. I've watched my son graduate high school, get married, have kids of his own. He's got my eyes. My wife remarried. Good man, treats her well. I want to be angry about it, but mostly I'm just glad she's not alone. Michael's voice joined in. We tried to escape, all of us, found exit ramps that led back to the same interstate, truck stops that faded away when we got close. The convoy isn't our prison, it's our home now, and this stretch of pavement, it's alive, feeding on something. Loneliness, maybe, or the dreams we had of getting home. His laugh was bitter as battery acid. The ironic thing is, we're together now. More brotherhood here than I ever found at real truck stops. We take care of each other. But that's not the strangest part. Earl's ancient voice whispered through the static. New guy, Jake, right? You've got maybe an hour before the choice gets made for you. The convoy's testing you, seeing if you're driver material for the long haul. Some men break down completely, start screaming, try to crash their trucks. Those ones disappear. We never see them again. But drivers like us, men who understand that the interstate is more than just pavement and paint, we get to stay together. Forever. The wedding ring felt like it was burning his finger as Jake realized that his anniversary dinner with Linda wasn't just postponed. It was never going to happen at all. The speedometer climbed past 90 as he approached the parked convoy, every survival instinct screaming at him to get past them and somehow find his way back to the world where his wife was probably setting the table for an anniversary celebration that now felt like it belonged to someone else's life. The three rigs sat in perfect alignment on the shoulder, their chrome bumpers gleaming like polished tombstones, marking graves of drivers who'd never made it home to their families. As he thundered past the first truck, something caught his eye that made his blood freeze. The hood was propped open, revealing nothing but empty space where a massive diesel engine should have been. No pistons, no cylinders, no radiator, just hollow cavity that swallowed his beam glow like a mechanical mouth that had been feeding on something other than fuel for 70 years. The driver's door of the middle truck hung open, swaying gently in desert breeze, like a mouth trying to speak words that had been forgotten since the Eisenhower administration. Jake caught a glimpse inside as he roared past. The cab was empty except for an ancient CB radio mounted on the dashboard, its microphone dangling by a frayed cord that looked older than his marriage to Linda. Static hissed from the speaker in rhythm that sounded almost like labored breathing, punctuated by clicks and pops that formed no recognizable pattern but somehow felt meaningful, like a language that predated human speech. On the floor, Jake spotted what looked like a logbook, with pages yellowed and scattered as if time itself had been tearing through the truck's interior for decades, leaving behind evidence of journeys that had never officially ended. But that's not the strangest part. As his truck cleared the convoy and the mysterious rigs disappeared behind him, an unsettling silence fell over the interstate like a burial shroud woven from decades of missing drivers. The usual road noise seemed muffled, as if the very air had thickened around his truck like invisible molasses designed to trap anyone who'd seen too much. His engine's rumble, normally a comforting constant that reminded him of home and honest work, sounded distant and hollow. Even the wind through his window had gone quiet, leaving only the soft whisper of tires on asphalt and the steady thump of his own heartbeat echoing in his ears like a countdown timer, measuring the distance between his old life and whatever was coming next. Jake remembered the last time he'd felt this alone. It was 2019, driving through Montana during a blizzard that had closed every truck stop within 100 miles. His phone had died. His CB was picking up nothing but static, and for 12 hours he'd been the only moving vehicle on an interstate that looked like the surface of an alien planet. His wife had been pregnant with their third child then, and Jake had spent those frozen hours convinced he'd never see the baby's face, never hold Linda's hand during delivery. He'd made a deal with God that night, get him home safely, and he'd never take another long haul. But when the storm cleared and the truck stops reopened, the pavement had called to him again, promising easier money and shorter trips. Route 34 had lied then, just like it was lying now. The road signs began changing as he drove deeper into desert that no longer resembled the Nevada he'd known for 12 years, displaying names of towns that belonged in fever dreams or the final nightmares of dying men. Whisper Falls, 15 miles, read one weathered sign, followed by Dead Horse Canyon, 8 miles, then Bone Creek, 23 miles. These weren't tourist traps or mining settlements. They sounded like places that belonged in the classified files of unexplained road phenomena. Settlements that should have been marked on maps, but somehow existed in the spaces between reality and madness. The GPS showed nothing but empty desert in all directions, yet the signs kept appearing with increasing frequency, as if he'd somehow driven off the edge of the known world into territory that cartographers had forgotten or deliberately omitted because some places were too dangerous to acknowledge. His fuel gauge was doing something that defied physics. The needle was moving backward, showing less fuel, even though he hadn't stopped for gas since Reno. But the truck kept running, the engine purring as if it was fed by something other than diesel. Jake thought about the emergency fuel fund his wife had insisted he keep. $200 in cash taped under the dashboard for situations exactly like this. "Promise me you'll never run out of gas in the middle of nowhere," she'd said, and he'd laughed, telling her that professional drivers didn't make amateur mistakes like that. Now, watching his fuel gauge defy physics, Jake realized that amateur mistakes were the least of his problems. Up ahead, illuminated in his beams like a beacon from an era when America was younger and interstates were lonelier, stood a large green highway sign that made his pulse sink into his boots. "Welcome to Sable Ridge. Population 847, founded 1952. But Jake knew that name from truck stop legends and late-night radio shows that specialized in stories truckers told but didn't really believe. Sable Ridge was a ghost town, a place abandoned in the 1970s after a mining disaster claimed most of its residents. The few survivors had packed up and left, and the desert had slowly reclaimed the empty buildings over 50 years of neglect. No one lived there anymore. No one had lived there since before Jake started driving. Yet here was its welcome sign, standing proud and defiant against the Nevada night. As he entered the town limits, Jake saw something that made him understand why some trucker ghost stories are warnings disguised as entertainment. The town wasn't abandoned. Streetlights flickered sporadically, casting intermittent pools of sickly yellow light that revealed buildings frozen in time. 1950s architecture with Art Deco flourishes, now cracked and weathered, but somehow still inhabited. The gas station ahead looked as if it had been waiting for customers who would never come. Its ancient pumps, the kind with mechanical numbers that flipped as they counted gallons, standing ready to serve drivers who'd been traveling routes that didn't officially exist. Jake pulled into the station, his fuel gauge finally demanding attention, despite everything else that had happened in this nightmare that should have ended hours ago. As he stepped out of his cab, desert air hit him like a physical presence, carrying scents of sage and something else. Something sweet and cloying that reminded him of flowers left too long in a vase at a funeral home. His footsteps on cracked concrete seemed unnaturally loud in the stillness, echoing off empty buildings like gunshots in a cathedral. Then he heard it, the soft sound of footsteps that weren't his own, coming from somewhere behind the station, keeping perfect time with his movements, like a shadow learning to walk. In the reflection of the gas station window, Jake saw them. 3 massive trucks sitting silently behind his rig, their chrome bumpers gleaming, their 1952 plates catching streetlight like mirrors reflecting his own approaching doom. They hadn't been there when he'd pulled in. He was certain of that, as certain as he was that his anniversary celebration was now nothing more than a memory from someone else's life. Inside the gas station, Jake found something that shouldn't exist. A fully functional truck stop from 1952, complete with drivers sitting at a lunch counter as if they'd been waiting for decades for their coffee to cool. The men wore clothes from another era. High-waisted pants, suspenders, hair slicked back with pomade that caught the fluorescent light. They turned to look at him with eyes that held the accumulated weight of mystifying miles, and Jake recognized some of them from the CB voices he'd heard earlier. Bobby Hutchins sat at the far end of the counter, his flannel shirt still crisp despite 36 years of wear. Michael Chen occupied a booth near the window, a cup of coffee steaming in front of him that never seemed to empty. "Sit down, son," said Earl Jameson, the ancient driver from 1952, patting the stool beside him. His face looked exactly as old as his voice sounded, weathered like leather left in the sun for 70 years, but his eyes were sharp and kind. "You've got questions, and we've got time. All the time in the world, unfortunately." Jake found himself walking to the counter despite every instinct telling him to run back to his truck. The coffee the waitress poured was the best he'd ever tasted, rich and dark and somehow familiar, resembling something his wife might have made in a dream. Here's where it gets beyond comprehension. The waitress was young, maybe 25, with victory rolls in her hair and bright red lipstick that belonged in a 1940s movie. But her name tag read Susan, 1973, and when Jake looked closer, he could see the sadness in her eyes. "I was driving to Las Vegas," she said, refilling his cup without being asked. "My boyfriend had proposed and I was meeting his parents. Never made it past mile marker 77. She'd been the only female driver the convoy had ever collected, and the other men treated her with a respect that transcended decades and circumstances. "We tried to warn you," Bobby said, stirring his coffee with a spoon that clinked against the ceramic. "The CB, the beams, everything we could do. But this stretch chooses who it wants, and once you've been chosen..." He gestured around the truck stop that existed outside of time and space. "Well, you get all this: brotherhood, endless conversations, and the best coffee you'll ever taste. Plus, you never have to worry about traffic jams or dot inspections ever again." His laugh was bitter but not unkind. Michael leaned forward from his booth, his engineer's mind still trying to solve problems that had no solutions. "I've been mapping this place for 28 years, he said, pulling out a notebook filled with sketches and calculations. "The truck stop exists in what I call a temporal pocket, a space where time flows differently. Outside, your families age and die, but in here, we're preserved at the moment we join the convoy. The coffee never gets cold, the food never spoils, and we never get tired enough to sleep. But here's what should terrify you." Earl pulled out a photograph from his wallet, black and white and creased with age. It showed a young woman in a 1950s dress holding a baby. "My wife Margaret, my son Tommy. He'd be 81 now if he's still alive." Earl's voice cracked slightly. "Sometimes I wonder if it's a blessing or a curse, being stuck like this. I'll never age past 37, never get sick, never die. But I'll also never hold another baby, never see a grandchild take their first steps, never tell my wife I love her one more time." Susan wiped down the counter with a rag that had seen decades of use. "The hardest part isn't being trapped," she said quietly. "It's watching through the windows. Sometimes, late at night, we can see into the real world. I've watched my sister's children grow up, get married, have babies of their own. My nephew looks just like his grandfather. My father, who died thinking I'd abandoned the family. He never knew I was trying to come home." The wedding ring felt impossibly heavy on his finger as Jake realized what they were telling him. "So this is it? This is forever?" The other drivers exchanged glances, and Bobby answered with the kind of honesty that only comes from decades of acceptance. "Forever's a long time, Jake. But it beats being alone on an endless interstate. Here we've got each other. We play cards, tell stories, share memories of the world we left behind. It's not the life any of us planned, but it's a life." Earl finished his coffee and stood up, his joints creaking like an old truck settling after a long haul. "Time to go, son. The convoy's calling and you don't want to keep them waiting. Trust me on that." Through the truck stop windows, Jake could see the 3 phantom trucks idling in the parking lot, their engines running silent as whispers. His choice was no choice at all. The pavement had already decided. How he'd gotten there, filling his cab with a voice that spoke of cosmic truths and terrible revelations that would redefine everything he thought he knew about America's interstate system. The same voice from Sable Ridge, but now carrying the weight of eternity and the patience of something that had been recruiting drivers since the first routes carved paths through wilderness. "Once you see them, you're already part of it, Jake," the voice said, each word dropping into silence like stones into still water that reflected nothing but darkness. "The convoy doesn't chase drivers, it recruits them. We've been looking for someone like you for a long time." Terror crept through anyone who's ever driven alone at night as the voice told him about drivers who'd vanished over the decades, good men who'd simply disappeared from interstates across America with no trace except their empty trucks found on remote shoulders like abandoned shells. "They didn't crash, didn't quit, didn't run away," the voice explained with the patience of someone who'd given this speech to countless drivers who'd made the same fatal mistake of seeing beams that shouldn't exist. "They joined us on the route that exists between the real interstates, the path that connects every ghost town, every abandoned truck stop, every mile marker that shouldn't exist but does." Tremors ran through Jake as he realized he was hearing his own future being described in matter-of-fact tones. Understanding that the convoy wasn't hunting him, it was saving him a place in their eternal caravan. The voice grew more personal, more intimate, as if it was reading from his own diary. "You remember that night in Montana, don't you, Jake? When you promised God you'd never take another long haul if he got you home safely? But you broke that vow within a week, didn't you? The pavement called and you answered, just like you always do. Just like you always will." His breath caught in his throat because the voice was right. He had made that promise during the blizzard, and he had broken it. Route 34 had always been stronger than his willpower, stronger than his vows to Linda, stronger than his desire to be a good husband and father. Jake looked out his windows and felt his last grip on sanity slip like sand through fingers that belonged to a man who would never again hold his wife's hand or taste her anniversary cooking. The landscape around him was fundamentally alien in ways that hurt his brain to process. Road signs in languages that used symbols instead of letters, pointing toward destinations with names that sounded like they belonged in the fever dreams of dying truckers. The sky had taken on a sepia tone, resembling an old photograph exposed to too much light, and the horizon seemed closer than it should be, as if he were driving on the surface of a much smaller world that existed in the spaces between reality and the collective unconscious of every driver who'd ever felt alone on empty interstates. But here's the truth that'll shatter everything you think you know about missing persons reports. His truck was simultaneously in multiple places at once. Through his mirrors, he could see glimpses of other interstates, other times. There was his truck in 1987, driving past Bobby Hutchins's broken-down rig. There it was again in 1995, Christmas Eve, following Michael Chen's trailer as snow began to fall. And there, in 1973, trailing behind Susan's compact car as she drove toward a future that would never arrive. Jake was experiencing every recruitment in the convoy's history, understanding that time wasn't linear on the Phantom Interstate. It was circular, recursive, folding back on itself like origami made from space-time. Through his windshield, Jake spotted what looked like salvation, a dirt path branching off to the right, unmarked by signs or mile markers, but representing the only escape route he could see from this nightmare stretch that had already claimed too many drivers. The voice on the CB seemed to sense his thoughts with supernatural precision. "You can try the dirt path if you want, Jake. They always do. Sometimes it makes them feel better about what's coming." But Jake was beyond caring about warnings or psychological games, played by entities that understood the loneliness of long-haul drivers better than their own families. His survival instincts had taken over, screaming at him to take any route that led away from whatever fate the convoy had planned for him. The dirt path stretched endlessly ahead, disappearing into darkness that seemed thicker than normal night. While above him, the sky had frozen like a photograph caught mid-development, stars suspended in positions that defied astronomy and mocked navigation. Time had lost all meaning. His clock had stopped working, and Jake couldn't tell if he'd been driving for minutes or decades since he'd last heard his wife's voice saying, "Drive safe, honey," in what now felt like another lifetime. His fuel gauge still read 3/4 full, exactly as it had when this nightmare began, as if his truck had become trapped in some eternal moment where anniversaries were promises that could never be kept, and wives were people who belonged to other men's lives. But here's the truth that'll haunt your dreams. The convoy that had been following him vanished sometime during the endless drive, their beams simply fading away like dying stars, only to reappear ahead of him, growing larger and brighter as they approached from the opposite direction. 3 trucks, perfectly spaced, their 1952 plates gleaming like mirrors reflecting his own approaching transformation. They weren't chasing him anymore. They were coming to meet him, to welcome him home to a place he'd never been, but somehow always belonged. The CB crackled one final time, the voice now familiar as his own father's. "Now you drive with us, Jake. The long route needs drivers who understand what it means to keep moving, even when there's nowhere left to go." The trucks separated to create a gap just wide enough for his rig to pass through, resembling an honor guard welcoming a new recruit to an army that fought no wars except against the loneliness of drivers who'd forgotten what home looked like. As he drove between them, Jake caught glimpses of the other drivers, real men with real faces, all wearing expressions of resigned acceptance that came after fighting against fate for so long that surrender became relief. They looked at him with eyes that held decades of accumulated road wisdom and the kind of peace that only comes when you finally stop pretending you have somewhere else to be. Bobby Hutchins raised his hand in the universal trucker's wave, his face visible for the first time through his cab window. He looked exactly the same as he had in the truck stop, 34 years old, despite 36 years on the Phantom Interstate. Michael Chen nodded solemnly from the middle truck, his engineer's notebook still visible on the dashboard, filled with calculations that would never solve the equation of how to get home. Earl Jameson, the original member of the convoy, smiled sadly from the lead truck, his weathered face holding the wisdom of 70 years spent learning that some routes never end. Here's where the truth becomes unbearable. Jake realized he could see into the real world through his mirrors. watching scenes from a life that was already slipping away from him like water through a broken dam. There was his wife, sitting at their kitchen table staring at her phone. She'd called him 6 times in the last hour, and each unanswered call had deepened the worry lines around her eyes. She was wearing the blue dress she'd bought for their anniversary celebration, the one that brought out her eyes and made Jake's pulse skip even after 15 years of marriage. In another mirror, Jake saw their children, Emma, 13, and trying to act like she didn't care that Daddy was late again. Marcus, 10, and pressing his face against the living room window, watching for beams that would never come. And little Sophie, 5 years old, and asking Mommy every few minutes when Daddy would be home to see her drawing of their family. The drawing showed stick figures holding hands in front of a house with a big truck in the driveway. In the corner, she'd written Daddy's home in crayon letters that broke what remained of his heart into pieces. But that's not the most heartbreaking part. Through another mirror, Jake watched the search that would begin in 12 hours. Highway patrol, finding his truck abandoned on Route 34, engine still running, logbook open to an entry that simply read, "Mile marker 77. Something's wrong." They'd search for 3 weeks, bringing in helicopters and search dogs, interviewing truckers at every stop between Reno and Las Vegas. His wife would appear on local news, pleading for information, offering a reward the family couldn't afford for any sign of her husband. The Convoy's CB crackled with Earl's ancient voice. "You want to know the real truth, Jake? We're not ghosts. We're not dead. We're something worse. We're forgotten. The world moves on without us, files us away as unsolved mysteries, and eventually even our families stop looking. But we remember everything, every birthday we missed, every anniversary that passed, every moment we should have been there but weren't." The wedding ring began to glow with an ethereal light, and he understood what was happening. The ring was the last connection to his old life, the final tether to the world where promises mattered and love could overcome anything. As he watched, the ring grew lighter on his finger, the gold fading as if it was dissolving into mist. "It doesn't hurt," Bobby's voice said gently over the CB. "Letting go never hurts as much as you think it will." In his rearview mirror, Jake saw the unthinkable truth reflected back at him. His own truck had become part of the Convoy now, one of 4 identical rigs rolling through eternal night in perfect formation. His reflection in the mirror showed a face weathered by mystifying miles, eyes holding the same resigned acceptance he'd seen in the other drivers. The man who'd promised his wife he'd be home for dinner was gone, replaced by someone who understood that some promises were bigger than the people who made them. The screen begins to fade as his consciousness merges with the rhythm of the pavement, becoming another chapter in the unexplained road phenomena that would lure future drivers into joining their endless caravan. But before the darkness takes him completely, Jake manages one last transmission on his CB, his voice already sounding like it belongs to someone else. "This is Jake Hendricks, now driving permanently with the 1952 Convoy. Tell Linda. Tell her I kept my promise. I'm home now." "We're all home." Jake Hendricks started that night as just another trucker trying to make his delivery on time and keep a promise to his wife. He ended it as something else entirely. A permanent resident of an interstate that exists outside our maps, outside our understanding, outside the comfortable boundaries of what we tell ourselves is possible when we kiss our loved ones goodbye and promise we'll be home for dinner. But here's what should really keep you awake tonight. Route 34 isn't the only stretch where reality gets thin around the edges and promises become lies we tell ourselves. Every interstate has its dark miles. Every highway has stretches where the normal rules don't quite apply. And every trucker has stories they won't tell their families because some truths are too heavy for the people we love to carry. The Phantom Convoy is still out there, rolling through the spaces between our world and whatever lies beyond it. adding new drivers to their eternal roster with license plates that prove they've been recruiting since 1952. They're looking for people who understand that the pavement is more than just a way to get from point A to point B. It's a living thing that demands sacrifice, loyalty, and sometimes complete surrender of the life you thought you were going to live. Maybe you've seen strange beams in your rearview mirror during late-night drives, illumination that follows too perfectly, matches your speed too precisely. Maybe your radio has picked up voices that shouldn't exist, or your GPS has shown routes that lead to places not found on any map. But here's the evidence that'll make you question everything you think you know about missing persons cases. Jake's fuel receipts from that night. They all showed purchases at gas stations that had been demolished years ago. His truck's GPS recorded a route that took him through 3 states he never entered. His cell phone showed dozens of missed calls from his wife, but the call logs timestamped them as coming from 1952. The security cameras on Route 34 recorded his truck driving alone, but if you enhance the footage, you can see 4 sets of tire tracks in the dust behind him. 3 of them don't match any tire pattern manufactured after 1955. Highway Patrol found his truck the next morning, parked safely on the shoulder, with the engine still running and his logbook open to an entry that simply read, "Joined the convoy. Tell Linda I'm sorry about dinner." But here's what they didn't release to the public. The odometer showed he'd driven 847 miles that night on a 200-mile route. His wedding ring was found on the dashboard, still warm to the touch. And in his CB radio's memory, investigators found a recorded message in his voice. "This is Jake Hendricks, now driving permanently with the 1952 Convoy. We're always looking for new drivers. Keep your eyes on your mirrors. And remember, once you see us, you're already part of the family." His wife never remarried. She kept his coffee cup on the kitchen table for 3 years, setting it out every morning as if he might walk through the door and ask what was for breakfast. Their children grew up with questions that had no answers, wondering if Daddy had left them on purpose or if something terrible had happened on that dark Nevada interstate. The house is empty now. She moved to her sister's place in California, unable to bear the memories. But sometimes, late at night, neighbors report seeing lights in the windows and the sound of a diesel engine idling in the driveway. The interstate is always hungry, always watching, always waiting for the next driver who thinks they understand the rules of the pavement. But Route 34 makes its own rules, and once you've seen what drives in the darkness between mile markers, you're never really alone on the interstate again. If these stories from America's haunted routes have opened your eyes to the shadows that live alongside our highways, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because there are more tales waiting in the darkness, more drivers who've encountered things that shouldn't exist, and more stretches of asphalt that lead to places that aren't marked on any earthly map. The convoy is always recruiting, and they're not just looking for truckers anymore. Anyone who drives alone at night, anyone who's ever felt that inexplicable urge to take an unfamiliar exit, anyone who's heard voices on their car radio when it's supposed to be turned off, you might be exactly what they're searching for. Sweet dreams and drive safely. You never know what might be following in your mirrors, or how many empty vehicles are waiting for you to join their endless journey to a destination that exists only in the spaces between mile markers and the dreams of drivers who forgot they had somewhere else to be. Just remember, if you're ever driving alone at night and see beams with 1952 license plates, don't slow down, but don't speed up either. Because Jake Hendricks learned the hard way that some routes don't care how fast you're going. They only care how far you're willing to travel from the life you used to know. And somewhere out there, on an interstate that doesn't appear on any map, 4 trucks are still rolling through the eternal night, their drivers finally home.